Yes, I'll raise you out of your lairs, smooth your bodies over, thin your fur, civilize you, spiritualize you, clear the dank growth from your choked and unfulfilled continents. But never forget, in your moment of darkest essence and need, the sacred beastly woods from which you came.
Welcome to the Drunken Odyssey with John King, a podcast about the writing life.
Tell us, oh muse, about a man whose mind and career has careened far and wide and upside down, whose computers are seared with crimes against grammar, whose typographical aggressions are legion, whose words flow into the very mouth of time, and more than a few bottles. A man who actually owns a typewriter, and perhaps even a soul.
And now, your host, John King.
Greetings, my drunken Odysseans, librettists, and mixologists, to episode 63 of the Drunken Odyssey. On today's show, I talk to the poet Tim J. Myers about his book, Dear Beast Loveliness, plus Dan Lauer writes about the impact of watching Spalding Gray swimming to Cambodia. So this week in books news, I note the passing of the crime writer Elmore Leonard. His novels were often adapted into films, most notably his novels Get Shorty, Out of Sight, and Rum Punch, which film lovers know as Quentin Tarantino's Jackie Brown. I wish I could say I've read his work before, and I actually have owned his books, but I've never spent my limited reading time in that direction. It's mostly a random oversight, but there you are. Elmore Leonard once shared his 10 rules for writing. 1. Never open a book with weather. 2. Avoid prologues. 3. Never use a verb other than said to carry dialogue. 4. Never use an adverb to modify the verb said, he admonished gravely. 5. Keep your exclamation points under control. You are allowed no more than 2 or 3 per 100,000 words of prose. 6. Never use the words suddenly or all hell broke loose. 7. Use regional dialect, patois, sparingly. 8. Avoid detailed descriptions of characters. 9. Don't go into great detail describing places and things. 10. Try to leave out the part that the readers tend to skip. Elmore Leonard points out, my most important rule is the one that sums up the 10. If it sounds like writing, I rewrite it. I think David James Poissant and I addressed the dialogue tag concern on our mailbag episode last week, and I probably didn't acknowledge Leonard's place in my thinking on that issue. Rules 8 and 9 indicate that neither characters nor setting or even things should be described in detail. Now, dear listeners, break up into groups and discuss this advice until most of you end up in a homicidal rage. Rule 5, you are allowed no more than 2 or 3 exclamation points per 100,000 words. Seems a little OCD to me, although I probably adhere to this rule. I'm just grateful he said 2 or 3, because if it was only 2, I'm not sure I could adhere to that. I love writing rules, not because I want to follow them or wrap myself up in them like they're a Snuggie, but rather for the logic behind an author offering that advice. If you'd like to hear David James Poissant and I opine on any aspect of creative writing, including the writing process, writing as a profession, how to fall in love, find a liquor store, or other serious matters of inquiry, please do write in. Every 2 months or so, he and I will answer your mail on this show. Lauren, if you please.
Dear listeners, writers, and fellow Odysseans, send your questions, observations, complaints, manifestos, transcriptions of Turkish opera, and whatever else you got to thedrunkenodyssey@gmail.com.
Thank you, Lauren. David James Poissant is the author of The Heaven of Animals, which will debut this March, but pre-orders are now available on Amazon. Help short story collections get more traction in the literary world by showing your support. See this week's show notes for details. And Elmore Leonard, may you rest in peace, free of a world of crimes against person, property, and grammar. And now, a word from our sponsor.
Imagine you're on a road trip. The air conditioner is gasping hot breath, dreaming its dream of Freon hypodermics. The front axle of this Plymouth Horizon is squeaking. Your sister-in-law has been singing along to gospel for 9 hours. She reeks of Shalomar. Crammed in the back seat, you stare at a pimple on the back of her neck and dream of popping it with a chainsaw. Wouldn't it be great to slip those earbuds in and listen to Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho instead? You can click on the audible.com link on the Drunken Odyssey's website for a 1-month free trial with a free audiobook download.
Speaking of crimes, and this is really peculiar, the novelist William T. Vollmann has an essay in this month's Harper's called My Life as a Terrorist, in which he writes about, no, certainly not being a terrorist, but rather reading his 785-page secret government file in which he was suspected to be the Unabomber because of some of the content of his fiction. Later, after he had been presumably ruled out because the Unabomber had been killed, he was suspected of being the anthrax terrorist. The book that started all of this was Vollmann's Fathers and Crows, a novel set mostly in Canada in the 17th century. William T. Vollmann is weird and anti-establishmentarian and is prone not to regard the law of the land with awe, but he is also the very embodiment of freedom, and he has a wonderfully expansive, inexplicable heart. When I lived in New York, I attended a Vollmann reading in a Barnes & Noble in which his voice rose over the cappuccino machines to declare his abiding affection for prostitutes. He invited anyone who wanted to stick around with him to drink at the bar across the street after the event. In short, what even admittedly illiterate rube in the government could fail to see that William Vollmann is one of the least likely people on the planet to be able to keep a secret? That's in this month's Harper's if you want to check it out. Matt Peters' Kickstarter campaign continues. If you want to learn more about his project to get pulp art for his new book project, see this week's show notes. As for my own writing life, I've got some editing done this week, but I'm eager to get this show started, so I'll talk about that next week, if I remember. And away we go.
And now, the interview of the day.
Well, my guest this week is a former contributor to this show, Tim J. Myers, who wrote an essay on Where the Wild Things Are, is the author of a book of poems called Dear Beast Loveliness, Poems of the Body. Tim, welcome to the show.
John, thank you very much for having me. I love Drunken Odyssey. I love what you're doing, and it is a delight to be here.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you here. This book is surprising in a couple of ways. One, I don't know that I've read a contemporary work that isn't novel in verse that really just attacks one theme. That's what you've done in this collection. And you write about this in the introduction, which is also something we don't see that much of these days, is books of poetry with introductions. Could you talk a little bit about what made you want to write these poems?
That's really an interesting question to me, John. I often ask myself, because I live in the Bay Area, but I live in the South Bay. I'm not conversant on a regular basis with a lot of poets. I suppose in some ways that's a good thing. You tend to go your own way more. But I also sometimes am surprised that I'm not necessarily up on things. The reason I wrote all on one theme is that I read somewhere, I was trying to get work published, and I read somewhere that books on one theme tend to do well. Now, the interesting thing was, you don't want to make a whole book based on a submission strategy, for goodness sakes. What I found when I started looking at my poems was that on the topic of the body, I had a book. And so that was where I went ahead with it. I mean, that was an organic thing. And it's interesting to think that there aren't books about single topics, although I can certainly understand why. It has to be something, obviously, that moves a person very deeply and preoccupies them. Not that there isn't a lot of that in the artistic world, there is. And then writing the introduction, it's funny. I guess I had no idea that's an unusual way to open a book of poetry. Since I write, I'm very much a generalist, and I write way too many different kinds of things. Practically speaking, there are too many of them. I just had things I wanted to say, and that seemed like a good place and way to say them. So I guess I have no more excuse for that. And whether I'm an iconoclast or a rube, I'm not sure. I'll go with both, probably. Huh?
Well, I think you're digging deep to a pretty powerful tradition. I mean, it's something that Coleridge did. It's something that Shelley did. I'm sure others did. For some reason, my mind just leaps to the romantic poets. I remember when I was pursuing my master's work, I was a little bit embarrassed to say that I wanted to study the Romantics, fearing that that would seem too rebellious somehow. So I had no idea how naive I was to think that that would seem rebellious in an academic context.
Well, I mean, it is funny too that it is. I mean, in its day, it was rebellious. I mean, Lord Byron was the profligate rock star of his day, as we know now. But as I said, maybe we lost this, but this, in the light of postmodernism, it doesn't seem rebellious at all. Things have changed in some ways that along those lines. And I suppose when I think of, I mean, you mentioned earlier that and you're the second person, by the way, who's talked about a Whitman influence in my book. I really didn't realize that at all, which is, I think, pretty naive of me. And it's one of those things, again, I think this is a real writer thing. Somebody who's not necessarily a writer will come up to you and say, wow, I love that poem. It reminded me of X, famous writer in the blank. And I'm like, that's the last thing I want to hear. And yet there often is a lot of truth to that. And I do love Whitman. And I believe that Whitman is still, I mentioned earlier too, that I'm finishing Leaves of Grass. And I'm certainly seeing things in Whitman that are not fully relevant now. But the depths of Whitman, in my opinion, are still as relevant as they were.
Well, I'm not a fan of Whitman, but
I gathered that.
In making that comparison, which I did before we hit record on the interview here, in terms of his approach to the body and his not being willing to consider it profane,
yes,
no matter what it's doing.
Yeah, and I like that very much. And by the way, I understand the lack of approval of Whitman. I had a professor who once accused Whitman of having diarrhea of the mouth. I think there are certainly some things about Whitman that are not what they could be. I have to agree with that, even though I revere the guy.
Well,
no, go ahead. Go ahead. Come on, this is what dialogue is all about.
Just anyone who would write a long book of poems called Song of Myself, just...
Okay.
All right, but it was called Leaves of Grass. Okay. No, it was a long poem in it that was called Song of Myself, but Jesus. All right. So in some ways, I think that his exuberance and his sort of spiritual approach to the body that is definitely not based in traditional mainstream church doctrine, I see that happening in your work, but you're much more of a craftsman than Whitman, and so for that I salute you.
Yeah, John. Oh, geez, yeah. Yeah, I really, and again, I'm one of those people too. I really became, like, what are the roots of one's own writing? I don't know what your story is, but for me, I started writing in 6th grade as a poet. So that's always the kind of the heart of what I do, even though I deeply love all these other forms. So that whole thing of really sitting down and putting the words together in a very careful way. I mean, craft is a beautiful word, and I very much love hearing that applied to these poems. That's a big thing for me.
And there are a lot of poems here. This is pretty big for a book of poetry.
See, there's another thing I didn't know. I'm like, give value, right? Anybody's going to shell out money to buy poetry, which is rare enough. Let's put some coupons on the back so they can go somewhere the Applebee's, Interesting.
I used to remember when you could tear off things in the back of books and send off for, well, it was usually more books, but...
Yeah, exactly. Feed the addiction.
But when did you decide that this was, a really good decision in terms of the theme, that this would carry you through an entire book of poems?
The little spark that got it going was as a submission strategy. I read somewhere, you're always reading advice about how to submit and how to get published. And so much of it is contradictory and all the rest. But it was like, you have a slightly better chance of getting accepted if your book is on a single theme, which again is obviously up for grabs, whether there's any truth in that. And it's been a while too, so maybe it was truer then, whatever. But when I looked and found that many poems, I saw that, this is that underground river thing, I think, in an artist. You don't necessarily know that there's something very deep, some topic or theme that's, or event or impulse, whatever, that's flowing very deeply in you. And when you find it, you find that there's a lot there underground. And that's what happened in this case. So I wasn't surprised, but I still was a little, oh, wow, this many poems about this. And of course, my first fear was, oh my God, how do you keep a single theme volume from being boring? It's all about the same thing. And as I looked at them, I felt there was enough variety. But of course, that's me just, throwing it out there saying, well, this is being an artist. I think this might be okay. And of course, I have to leave that up to everybody else to judge. But that's what happened.
But why this theme?
I think there are some personal and some self-historical, so to speak, aspects of this. One thing is I'm the physical type. I just have been since I was a kid. I've always loved sports, and not to put too fine a point upon it. And I'm almost quoting an actress on The Newsroom from the other night. Sex is, well, here's where it runs into this whole other thing. Growing up Catholic, when I was a kid, so I just turned 60, and I was in Colorado Springs, and my family were super Catholics. I have an uncle who's a priest and a writer. I grew up in a super Catholic world, and there was a tremendous amount of sexual repression. So I think my natural tendency, and I don't think that's unique to me, I think that's pretty common to most of us, we are very sexual creatures, ran into that Catholic suppressed tradition. By the way, the church has a long and varied history. It's not always been super suppressive, but suppressing, I guess I should say. So there was one of those tensions set up. In fact, John, if I could say, if there's one thing that drives me to this, and I still to this day feel it, which is very odd in the world of reality TV, where you hear stuff on the Kardashians that would have gone to the Supreme Court 30 years ago. It's this amazing, I keep having this thought, it's like, oh my God, this whole thing about sex, it's all a huge secret, but it's such a giant, but they can't keep it. So my wife, for example, when she's in third grade, she's sitting at a baseball game and there's a couple in front of her with a kid. Now she's ultimately, she's preternaturally smarter than I am about this kind of thing. She figured out the birds and the bees from that. Mother, father, kid. I was so sheltered, I didn't know for years. So that big lie, I think, is one of the things that drives me, and I still look at it today and go, wow, how did they ever think they could cover that up? And yet they acted like they did. They acted like that was actually the goal.
Well, there's a lot of interesting aspects to this, and yeah, I'm not sure people who are 20 years younger than me can appreciate this.
I agree.
I think the internet's changed a lot of things. Like, wow, a person can do that with a dog. Okay. Right. Not many mysteries left if you can Google.
Well, I think you're so right. And I think one of the biggest things that's happened in American cultural history, in my opinion, has been the 60s. That's not a unique opinion, and it's pretty obvious. But of the many revolutions that started at that time, one of them was, of course, the sexual revolution. And there have been previous, like the 20s and the Jazz Age had its sexual revolution, but we're still playing this whole thing out. And one of the things I think you see today, the irony of, in comparing this to my Catholic boyhood, is huge. We're seeing the rush to the other side, the mad rush to the other side. And what's interesting, too, is what starts out as sexual repression or suppression, when you go to the other side with that swing of the pendulum, what you often don't get sexual freedom in a real meaningful way. You get the rush to titillation and commercialization and over-sexualizing. Human beings have trouble getting this one right. I can make that statement.
Well, we're appallingly fallible creatures to start with.
Yes, we are.
Well, I think of, and this is maybe the most unpoetic thing I can think of, but when I was a child, there was a show on called Wonder Woman. And
I remember.
I love camp and I love kitsch. And I went back 5 years ago and tried to watch some of it. It's unwatchable.
Yes. Yeah.
But if you're 8 years old and it's all you have, watching Linda Carter strut around and just exist for, 42 minutes out of an hour on TV might seem like it's worth watching in a much different cultural environment.
I think that's a great point. I don't think that's unpoetic at all. I mean, this was part of the result of sexual repression, suppression, was that people twist themselves to try to, act out these normal human/animal urges. And so there's even a little poem in my book about looking at the Sears catalog lingerie ads when I was a kid. I also love this whole conflict in a culture. And I taught adolescents for 14 years as a classroom teacher. What do you do when you're an adolescent and there are these huge life tasks that you have to go through? I mean, we could even argue that you don't have to drink, although most people do. Certainly, unless you're somebody very, very different, you're going to have sexuality and sex in your life. But none of it in those days, especially, was officially sanctioned, taught, discussed by most people. So you're thrown out into the night, basically, trying to find your way, young, confused, and I had misinformation, that whole part amazes me too. It's like we put something that is so, for God's sakes, a happily married couple, whatever their sexual orientation, with or without children, is the basis of the society in some ways. You'd think we would recognize as parents and teachers and, officials and citizens that we need to think about those things and talk about them so people can learn how to do them. They're basic life tasks. That wasn't that way then. And it's better now. But now, like I say, there's the opposite problem with all the sideshow stuff that goes on around what's supposed to be sex or sexuality and often isn't.
And we're still dragging ourselves out of the muck in some cases where we actually have to persuade people rape is bad and shouldn't happen, and it really is a crime. To some degree, it's shocking that the whole shebang isn't this much further along when you've got these holdouts that are just crazy.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And this is, I love your phrase that we are appallingly fallible. In fact, obviously, too, we can take that and say there are aspects of humanity probably acted out by a small minority of people, sometimes by a majority, given the historical circumstances like Nazism, where we are horrifically dark in our impulses. And a lot of that, obviously, and for obvious reasons, gathers around sexuality. So, the idea of what sexuality means in terms of attacks on women, for example, which are, we all know, I'm not trying to do my feminist cred here, but I mean, I just blanch to think of these things. So here we are in the context of trying to find some balance in this. And like you say, we're still fighting that war. And that war has also become more foregrounded for us recently, which is also part of the sexual revolution, by the way.
Well, and I don't think it's a feminist point to even make. I mean, I want to share a world with women, and we just can't have this.
No, we cannot. It's horrific. But when I just think of what it's like with all, and again, my book is full. It's full not only about sex, but also about mortality and disease and the rest. All these things that can assail the body or fill it with joy or whatever. The sense of that your own body being vulnerable to that level of violation that women have to think about. Obviously, it happens to men sometimes too, but obviously far more to women. It's a violation not only of an individual and of a body and the rest of it. It's a violation of the whole existential circumstance of being a human being with a body, which is also true, obviously, of when someone tortures you. I mean, it's the same thing. And we have this incredible vulnerability because of our bodies, and yet everything that we are is based in our bodies too. So again, I go back to that whole tension, the rich tension kind of thing that led to the book.
Well, I don't want to give listeners the wrong impression. You don't write about rape, but you do write about the, let's say, insane spirituality of sexuality, which is to say that even at our best, we're really not in control.
Yeah, that's actually a good challenging question. I think people can find a balance. I also think people can mature, but I know that millions of people do not. I always say that there are a lot more adults in the world than there are grown-ups. So I think the sex is one of those constant human challenges. And in fact, this is obviously not an original idea of mine, but one of the basic postmodern ideas is wherever there's power, I mean, this is also an older idea. Shelley wrote about power, and so did many people. But wherever there's power, there is tremendous potential for wrong. And the fact that we recognize that more and more, I think, is a really beautiful thing. But it's also, we have to face that dark potential. Appallingly fallible, John. You said it. That's a very good phrase.
Well, and when I say in control, what I'm referring to is we open ourselves up to all kinds of emotions that no matter what stage in life we're not necessarily prepared for, or it's overwhelming, and that's what I meant by insane. Just
no, actually I understand your point now. I misunderstood.
A more appropriate word would be sublime, I think.
Well, and isn't it funny? I mean, how many great poetic lines are about the madman and the genius, madman / genius, that kind of thing. Genius in that sense of being sublimely inspired. I love the Old Testament story about Jacob wrestling with the angel. And when I was a kid, that was not the kind of story that they could tell, because it didn't have a clear narrative line. And it's so heavy with symbol, it's kind of hard for a kid to get it. But as an adult, the idea of this strange being that comes to you in darkness and attacks you, and that this is somehow has potential for great spiritual growth. I mean, my words are failing me. Again, this would be something you'd want to write a poem about or a song. The way we're talking about sexuality there fits perfectly. Like, this could be a demon, this could be an angel, and it depends on how this wrestling goes. And of course, that wrestling has this, slightly erotic overtone, lovers grapple and that kind of thing. To me, that's an incredibly rich, beautiful story, and in the end it's an uplifting story, even though it's so odd and dark.
Well, and I think it's a dialectic that never fully settles, and I think you wrote about this beautifully in your poem When Daniel Judged Susanna. Would you be willing to read that?
I would be happy to read it. I like that poem a lot because it seems to be a way for me to talk about that whole thing. I write, ironically, with biblical language. So, of course, it's kind of going back to my Catholic upbringing. When Daniel judged Susanna, I will not say the prophet was a coarse or venal man. But when the elders had threatened that virtuous woman, whose body even beneath clothing awoke their lust, made them sick with love longing, when they threatened her unless she submit to them, she refused, accused them in turn. All was brought to the prophet Daniel, on whose judgment Susanna was depending. And standing before him, she recounted how the old men, peeking hot-eyed through swaying ferns, had watched from green shadows as she bathed, white form in womanly fullness, breasts, hips, eyes dark and beckoning, though she thought she was alone. And Daniel in his wisdom saw through the elders' lies, rebuked them, confined them, restored to her the esteem of the people. I will not say he did less, nor accuse him of hypocrisy or baser motive. Only I find it worthwhile to mention that as he turned to go, he found himself suddenly possessed by a vision of water streaming over her shoulders, her nipples, dripping from the arch of a perfect lifted white foot. And for many days this shadowed him with a sweet and continuous trouble.
That pretty much describes probably 25% of my conscious life.
It's interesting too, the way we've been talking about this. As I read that, I thought, and I didn't see this in the poem before, what a perfect depiction of this whole life of growing up in a suppressed community that represses sexuality, and yet trying to hit that balance that there is. I believe in sexual restraint. I believe in sexual morality. I think those things are vital and critical. And yet at the same time, like you said, some of that insane / sublime giving of the self to that animal moment it's necessary and it's real. So anyway, that poem seems almost like I was writing it to my uncle the priest as a kind of a, please, Uncle Raul, do you see where I'm coming from on this?
And it shows the difference between the mind and the body. That is to say, we can make our bodies behave, I think, but our minds are less easy to discipline.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
And that's a Christian story, but it's not from the Bible, is it?
I believe it's from the Apocrypha of the Old Testament, John. I could be wrong about that.
No, it is. I was raised a lapsed Catholic, so I actually know this story from the opera by Carlisle Floyd, who set it in the American South, if you can believe it.
Oh my gosh. No, I didn't even know. Carlisle Floyd.
Yeah. Yeah, back when I was more up to date on contemporary classical music.
Good for you. Dang.
It's a pretty wonderful opera.
That sounds great.
Oh, and it has, strains of Appalachia and things in it. So, and I feel like you really captured in that poem the balance between recognizing the spiritual right of this woman to be unmolested by men and unjudged by men, and yet nevertheless completely granting the lust that she would inspire in other people.
One of the greatest things that ever happened in modern American culture to me is the feminist movement. And I actually became, here we are going back to this, right? I actually became a feminist in the moment as a junior in high school when I suddenly, because at that time, it was the whole thing was like, okay, first African Americans want their rights. And then it was like, and I lived in Colorado, Latinos want their rights. And then I heard this thing like, well, women want their rights. And I remember I was thinking, and I was just a junior and I was not a super mature kid, but I remember thinking, well, of course, people aren't fair to women, and they're half of the population. We know now a little more, right? So I think that push was one of the most important things. It shaped my life, my wife's life, my daughter's life, my son's lives, and yet, of course, it set up all kinds of tensions.
You write quite a bit about sex. So what's one of your other poems that is among your favorites on the subject?
The title is just Sex. And this one will probably make more sense considering what we've talked about, because it's that whole idea of growing up in the world where it was just considered a kind of a secret. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's the bigger point, and I think you referenced this earlier when you talked about this human vulnerability. Vulnerability, when you think of it as wow, that's something I hadn't thought about that like that. What a huge part of being human is to be vulnerable. Anyway, this is called Sex. It's as if the body were a fortress, isolate Ticonderoga, thick-walled, built to withstand. But a spy has come in darkness who knows a secret door, knowing too that a traitor within will welcome him. And once the saboteur has stolen through, has penetrated the great ramparts, the whole fort will shudder to its foundations, even the stones in the walls relieved at finally being breached. It's funny, John, too. I've read this poem in public, I don't know, maybe 3 times. But when I read it in public, people sometimes start laughing, which surprised me at first. And then I realized, well, it's almost, a thinly veiled, phallic symbols and all the rest of it. But I think people get a huge kick. You see this in comedy sometimes. I think people get a kick out of watching the tension between our self-control and our animal nature. I think they think it's funny when we are like, after this. I can remember how they used to do it with the wolf guys on Mighty Mouse who are dressed up as zoot suiters.
Tex Avery cartoons.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think part of that is that whole thing about we all recognize as adults that this is a common feeling and that we're all struggling to some degree to keep it under wraps or to keep it appropriately expressed.
So you write about so many different aspects of the body that I think you don't really have a chance to exhaust the topic. It's so versatile, and while sex is obviously automatically a matter of curiosity, and you write about it in ways that I find so interesting, the fact that your wife is the object of so much desire in these poems seems relatively unique in the poetry world.
Yeah, that again, I suppose my first answer for that one is I got damn lucky. And there's no question about that. She's amazing and I'm crazy about her. So, that's just a basic thing. And it's funny too, because this to me is one aspect of poetry that has drawn me to it from the beginning. I read things sometimes attacking or kind of dismissing the lyric mode, that whole voice, but to me that's a very real thing and it continues. I think it will continue. I think it's normal to humans. And nothing is more natural than to want to sing about love and sex coming together. In fact, it's the songbird, and that's an image that's been used a million times for very good reasons. But I think part of that too is that, again, there's part of that balance. Not everyone in life is lucky enough to find a person that they love like that, particularly a person that they also desire like that. One of the things I understood as I grew up was that this is, and it goes back to a point you made before, it doesn't always fit the way it should, our sexuality. In fact, the way I look at it is human sexuality is a rough order system. It works as a system, and there's a tendency for human beings to seek each other, find each other, to have families, to fall in love and everything. But because it's a rough order system, there's betrayal, there's divorce, there are affairs, there's this, there's that, But it's also very, this sounds obvious too. I think sometimes it gets a little lost in modernity, but having our ideal that we're shooting for, I think, is critical because we need to have a destination to aim for. Those poems about her are simply based on impulse, but I like the way that they fit in with this theme about what human sexuality can be, what an incredibly precious gift it is with all its dangers, but what it can be when we do our part as best we can. Yeah, that's what that's about.
Well, I just think that it's relatively unique, and sometimes the things that form the core of our life that we might accidentally take for granted are actually the things that other people need to hear.
Well, I think that's a really good point. I think, if you're really a literary artist, then one of the things you do is seek out that which is deep and that which is arresting. You want to involve your reader. You're looking for that which is unique. You want to explore things. On the other hand, some of the most basic things, and again, that's a big part of my impulse to write this one, some of the most basic things are more profound, and there is that very strong tendency in human beings to take a lot of these things for granted. I love this quote from Emerson that I actually quote in my fatherhood book, where he talks about, to tell the truth, I'm paraphrasing this, I'm not going to get it right, but he says something like, to speak truth, most adult persons do not see the sun. Now, this is just, it's startling to me how true this is. We have this humongous ball of gas lighting our world like a lantern hung there. And of course, we've got things to do. I take it for granted plenty of times too. But some of these things are so common and so, the only word I can use for them is miraculous. I use that word a lot. And this is a Whitman thing. There's the great lines in Whitman I love about where he says to me, every square inch of earth and space is a miracle. That's very much my tradition.
And there's also, in your dealings with the theme of the body, and I say this like that's, I don't know, your program, and it doesn't seem like that's exactly the way you thought about it. But you also write about sickness in ways that I found really touching.
Yeah, I think this is one of those things, if you look at Eros, you see this Janus-like quality to it, as we said before. It's some of the worst things human beings do. Some terrible darkness comes through sexuality, and then some of the most beautiful, uplifting things, and it's often the threshold of love. The body itself has that quality when it comes to health and injury or disease. And I think part of becoming an adult, or a grown-up, to use our earlier terminology, is that you understand that these things can happen to anybody at any time out of the blue. I'm very much a person of faith, but my faith does not include a shred of, and I really dislike and am very uncomfortable with these ideas of divine providence being, oh, don't worry, he's looking out for you and all this stuff. I'm like, oh, wow, is he? So what about this guy, and what about this woman, and what about these kids in Central Africa and all the rest? So this whole thing about illness and disease, that's part of being human. And that's one of those darker aspects. And I lost a sister to anorexia, and of course that is part of that. I have a nephew who is severely mentally ill, and the heroics that my sister and brother-in-law do to help him live a somewhat normal life. And this guy, John, my nephew, what did he ever do? He didn't do anything wrong. This happened to him. So yeah, that's a big part of it. That has to be a big part of it.
Would you be willing to read the poem about your sister?
Yes, absolutely, I'm willing. This was a tragedy that has echoed in my family for a long time. And in fact, this poem, when you hear it, you'll realize that it's in the old Catholic tradition, it's a confession. The poem is called Anorexia. My sister died when none of us were looking. She'd grown thin as a rake handle, leaf thin, cold as November wind, an autumn world withdrawn into its narrowing self. We were many and loud with desires, a big happy family, the envy of others, played basketball on our parents' driveway, drank beer and talked long into the night, ate like farm animals. But she'd learned to hate food, to fear it, slowly became a desperate, impoverished dictatorship sealing its own borders. She moved to Chicago, left teaching to become a flight attendant, loved us quietly from the distance her new appetite for suffering forced her to, from jet aisles where she served food to strangers, looking appropriately slender in her uniform. We loved the sun, met for family dinners, began producing grandchildren, went camping out under the bright, fertile stars. Forgive us. We didn't want to know how the planets were spinning out of their orbits, drifting, fragmenting, colliding there in her head.
And I think that's indicative of one of the things that poets really need to do, which is throw yourself under the bus, so to speak. That
Yeah.
you have to accept your blame in things, even if it's
Yep.
not mostly your fault. To understand your own sense of fallibility.
This is Jacob wrestling with the angel again, right? That the angel doesn't come with sweetness and light. The angel comes with power in the dark. The angel comes to overwhelm you. I'm the oldest son. I mean, I'm the oldest kid in the family. And I've often gone back. I mean, she died in 85, so I've been doing this for years. But I've often gone back and said, I could. By the way, when she first got sick, we'd never heard the word anorexia or eating disorder. But we knew there was a problem, and there was a huge amount of denial in the family, and I was part of it too. And I've often thought I could have started an intervention. Some of those things over time you learn to forgive yourself, and you're going to have to live with it. But who knows what would have happened. But yeah, I agree. I think that idea about going down into the depths of yourself and looking at it all is a very important thing and not easy. And I'm in no hurry to do it, but sometimes I have to.
I laughed inappropriately during your response because you used the word intervention, which is, again, one of those very... Right, you didn't have that word, I don't think, back.
That's right.
When
we didn't.
Needed it.
Isn't that interesting, John, when you think of that? Part of the reason I'm very happy, again is the wrong word, to read this poem is because I have seen very specifically how the new language that came with certain aspects of psychology in general to the world, and, for example, the understanding of eating disorders and addiction, new language is like a torch that takes us into darkness where we can see our way. Eating disorder, addiction, intervention, those are terms that were hard won and are very, very important. Obviously, they're overused and there's, psychopop babble and all the rest of it, but they're very important.
I found the poem very moving, and so, yeah, my brief snort during your answer should not be indicative.
Don't worry about it. I'm telling you, if there's anybody on earth who would understand that, it's my sister Mary, and she'd be laughing with you. No question about it.
But a lot of my poems are basically confessions about how I could have done things better.
That's interesting.
Although I think I also do enjoy misbehaving, and so I'll...
Okay, so you're going down into the darkness of yourself publicly right now in a big way.
Maybe. I'm probably too facile a person to actually...
I find that hard to believe.
Well, stick around.
Okay.
I do note, I'm not a person of faith, but I do love literature. And so when I hear you talk about angels, I am refreshed to hear that you seem familiar with the Bible, which is to say angels are not comforting to people.
No, exactly. I'm a storyteller. I actually do storytelling. I mean, actual folk tales and things all the time. And it's very, very similar, the tradition about fairies. So since about Shakespeare's time, there was a big shift and fairies were come to be seen as small little beings who flitted about the garden and everything. People in the old traditions who believed in fairies were scared to death of them because the fairies were so powerful. They could do something wonderful. They could do something terrible. The angels are not. I like Rilke's way of looking at angels. Angels are these. If an angel ever appeared to you, you'd be so flummoxed, overwhelmed, confused, terrified. You would just, the last thing it would be is, oh man, an angel, everything's fine. Can I play your harp music with you? Yeah. Those old traditions about spirituality, in fact, to me, this is one of the things that makes a spiritual tradition great, is that it has the depth and the darkness to it that real living requires. And the Hindus have Kali. This goddess is a goddess of death with, bones around her neck and corpses and all this stuff. They have brought that more to the fore than a lot of other religions have. And I think that's a very positive thing. It's very weird to a lot of people who haven't experienced it before, but I think it's very good.
Well, angels are not this very nice Australian woman who wanders around looking to help. people.
Exactly.
But in the Bible, the first thing that happens is, people lose their mind.
Right.
Before an angel even says, hi, it's, oh my God.
Exactly.
And so you write about lots of different other physical activity, including athletics, and you've got a poem here about the Vietnam War.
Something in your voice brings up my fear about that poem, which is the fact that I never went to Vietnam. I worried about going to Vietnam when I was a freshman in college. That was the year they started the lottery. We were all scared to death that we were going to go. One of my friends was trying to hurt himself playing basketball so he wouldn't have to go. I mean, we were young, not very smart about it. I think part of what scares me and brought me to that poem, because that's not a subject I write about much. I mean, I maybe have 2 poems about it, was I'd made up my mind, John, at that point that if my number came up, I would go. And I mean, I thought long and hard about this. I wasn't, at that age especially, I wasn't particularly politically aware. I mean, it was the 60s. People knew what was going on. But what I thought in my heart, and I know now this would have been a horrible mistake, was I love my country. I really do love America. Now I look back and think that could easily have destroyed me, as it hurt and destroyed many, many others. Plus, it's much clearer now, I mean, in my ignorance at the time, that was, as many of us now realize, an unjust war based on, even worse than unjust, it was a war based on an amazing ignorance about political relationships in Asia. Because we all know that within 2 years after the fall of Saigon, I don't know if it was 2 years, China and Vietnam had a border war. You know, thousands are killed, and this was the monolithic communist. You can see where I'm going with all this.
You know, I once studied with the poet Susan Mitchell, and she had a poem in the New Yorker. It was an elegy for a child that she never had. And she said that she was a bit discountenanced. All right, I'm trying to find an appropriate verb here.
I like discountenance. That's a great verb.
You know, she wasn't offended or confused. She was a little bit nervous when people who had lost children wrote in saying, thank you for writing this poem because you've lost a child and you know what it's like too. And, she's a poet.
This is a constant problem with artists, I think. I think actors get this in a version that everyone can understand, which is people have such a tendency to believe that the actor's character is who the actor is. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we are creatures of imagination. This is what we use. And I believe very much in the principle that any artist can take on any topic. I don't like those restrictions. I remember the first time I saw a Japanese woman playing Bach, I thought, wow. And then I thought, wait a minute. Do you really want to deny European classical music to somebody because she's, but this issue comes up all the time, though. That's an easy example, right? So I do believe in artistic imagination there. I do think there's a point at which you can go too far, and obviously you can co-opt somebody's culture, and you can pose and not be genuine, and you can use somebody else's material just to get yourself to look good. None of that's legitimate, but I do believe in that the imagination is what we're supposed to be doing. So yeah, even though I wasn't there, I felt okay to write about it. But it's not the kind of poem I'd lead with ever. For those reasons. Interestingly, I knew a guy who was a very successful poet who wrote about Vietnam constantly. And I was amazed to find out afterwards that he didn't go. And I didn't automatically think, well, that's hypocritical. I realized this was a theme that, are we going to be down on Hilary Mantel? You didn't live in the time of Cromwell and Henry VIII. You can't write Wolf Hall. That doesn't make any sense at all, right?
No, it doesn't.
No.
Well, and I think the Vietnam War is such a touchstone for just what being alive in the 1970s meant.
I think that's a profound statement on your part. You can even see that in the musical Hair, where the way the hair, I don't think that's a great musical, and I like some of the songs, but the way everything pushes toward the climax of this guy going off to Vietnam, and that's a darkness that overshadows all this hippie joy and harmony that they're trying to put forward. Yeah, that's a really good point. Of being alive in the 70s. Yeah, that's right. It's almost like Vietnam is kind of a ideational ritual, or that sounds pretentious. I don't mean it that way. Some kind of ritual way, an emotional way of thinking about life. Yeah.
And the culture you live in. And I do remember, I have to confess this. I know I'm supposed to identify with the hippies, but when Treat Williams takes his buddy's place and then winds up getting shipped off to Vietnam when he wasn't expecting that and then dies over there, for some reason I thought that was funny.
Well, actually, you know what? I think this is appropriate to I think it's germane to what we're talking about. Something like that. Now, I can't speak for you, and I don't mean to sound like I'm giving your reaction here, but if we believe that the artist has the right to use imagination to inhabit other lives, that doesn't take away the responsibility to inhabit them in a way that is believable. And hair's a bit glib, as a lot of hippie stuff was. People were experimenting and they were young and all the rest of it. So maybe the reason it seemed funny to you is it just was it didn't work artistically. Maybe it was a failure of the imagination.
I'm not sure if I can believe the army would be that incompetent as to not know who they're sending overseas.
That's a good point.
On the other hand, I guess I can believe it, but I guess the thing was, I think that plot point was so over the top and ridiculous. Yeah. And I didn't like the character enough in the first place so that when it went wrong for him, instead of going, oh gosh, this is a tragic moment, I thought, look at how funny that is.
Well, it's funny that you'd mentioned that, because I can remember having to switch into that mode that I sometimes do in movies, which is I have to look at the meaning of this, not the way it's hitting me, because the meaning is good, but it's not hitting me as a story element. And that, that's a pretty artistic way of looking at something. I don't mean artistic in the positive sense. I mean, you're always looking at how do they put it together? What are the nuts and bolts? What's the craft issue involved?
Yeah, I wasn't willing to grade it on a curve. People don't watch it much these days. And actually, I do think, a little bit like Uncle Tom's Cabin, you get a whole lot of what was going on in the culture wrapped up in the movie. And artistically, it is better than Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, maybe Uncle Tom's Cabin should have been a musical.
I'm sure it has. I don't want to hear it.
I'm sure it has too.
And some of the songs are really pretty rockin' in here.
Yeah.
All right, but let's reel it back in. So, how many poems are in this book?
I haven't counted them. I mean, it's a 2-page table of contents, and it's 2 full pages. So, boy, there are a lot. I don't know. We're hitting, it's 111 pages. So, there are a lot. Just in case anybody's listening who's thinking about potentially buying the book, a bunch of them are short. I don't want anybody to think, oh, my God, this is Mort d'Arthur. I can't do that. I can't handle it.
Well, there are lots of surprises, like poems that are incredibly short, these sort of brief meditations. And then you also have some other surprises which surprised me, which is, on occasion, you, and I don't mean to upset people, I don't mean to be too controversial. Occasionally you rhyme.
Isn't that funny? We could talk about sex, eating disorders, death, disease, all the rest of it, but oh my God, it's rhyme. To me, the idea that there would be people who are against rhyme, and I mean in the overall sense, in the absolute sense, because obviously one of the reasons that people are against rhyme is because rhyme is so poorly done, because it's very complicated and it's very challenging. But to be against it, to me, is to, from a craft point of view, I don't see it. It doesn't make sense to me, because it's like, okay, I'm Van Gogh. I'm going to use this amazing blue and this amazing yellow, but no reds. I'm not going to use reds in my painting. Why would you give up some part of your palette? The other thing for me is that this aspect of poetry it's really kind of strange to me and awesome, John, that I'm drawn, and it's not just me, this is true for many poets, I'm drawn to this idea of the sonorous sweep of language, particularly when you're either reading it aloud or sub-vocalizing it as you write it or read it. And it actually goes back, I think, to picturing an Irish bard in a king's court, or in Iceland, the Eddas, where the bard is there reciting the genealogy of the king and these myths and the rest of it. I love that Walter Pater quote, "Poetry is language that aspires to the condition of music." Mm-hmm. And since I'm a songwriter, this is a big thing for me, because I'm constantly at that borderline between poems that are more sound-oriented and actually what is it that causes something in my mind to cross over to become a song. Those two are very close. So when I think of rhyme too, when I think of rhyme in the modern world, one of the things I think is hilarious, this is so nerdy of me to say this, but rap and hip hop, with so much focus on crime and misogyny. I mean, obviously there's a lot of great rap and hip hop that's not about those things, but so much of it, it's so badass. It's inner city, it's dark, and it rhymes. It's like, what did you guys go do? Or did you grow up on Mother Goose when you're living in, inner city Detroit? And when I see rhyme there, I know that rhyme has not just a pretty sound function. I mean, a prettiness of sound function. Mm-hmm. It has a public declamatory force to it that makes it something really powerful. And that's kind of what pulls me to those. Long answer, sorry. Short question, long answer.
The declaration, this is art, motherfucker, listen.
Exactly. It's funny. Lori Halse Anderson, I saw her speak at Hickleby's, the wonderful Hickleby's children's bookstore in San Jose. And she actually showed us a tattoo that she'd just gotten. She has it right on her wrist on her right hand. And it's the first word from Beowulf. And the word is, I don't know, speak is in the English translation. I don't know what it is in Old English. But the idea that she put this, this declaration to remind her that this is her job to speak, I thought that was really awesome. And, we see this, for example, one of the reasons there are weddings is that people get up in front of other people and say to a whole group of others, I pledge my troth. I mean, we don't say it that way, obviously, but there's something about speaking to that group that's a very powerful and potentially sacred thing, in my opinion.
Well, also, it's the modern writers who killed the place of rhyme. And Frost made it seem even more old-fashioned by doing it and keeping it in New England.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't think of that.
So that in terms of modern practitioners, it's almost this dirty secret. And it's also, I think, part of that typical separation between high art and low art, where rap is never considered high art. In fact, it's been a struggle for people just to admit that it is art.
Right.
Because that word art carries so much cultural weight that it shouldn't. There's plenty, kind of like the word poetry. For the general public, poetry always means something that is awesome and something that you never want to read.
Exactly. There's this, yeah.
And it's like, no, there's shitty poetry. There really
All
is.
kinds of, I've written a lot of it. A lot of that shitty poetry has my name on it.
Most poetry is bad. So, and if I teach my students that so that they're then empowered to think, well, if I'm allowed to not like poems, maybe that means I'm also allowed to like poems, and I actually have to think about this stuff.
That's interesting. I appreciate the logic of that, because if the Shakespeare gets exactly the same treatment. In general currency, Shakespeare is the thing that's the high, wonderful thing that nobody ever wants to see. And if you pull him down off his pedestal and look at what he really does, obviously there are all kinds of practical language challenges there. You're going to be, if you can dislike something, you can like it. I think that's a great point. Well, postmodernism is such a huge thing, and I don't know enough about it to make big general statements, but one of the postmodern ideas that I read about is to erase this big distinction between high art and low art. Mm-hmm. I think that can easily be overstated, but I think that's a really wise philosophical and aesthetic idea. These things are not necessarily as different as they may seem. Now, I want to be careful here, though, because something like rhyme, again, it's mishandled all the time. But when, I as an individual artist, obviously I want to be taken seriously as a literary artist, even though I do all kinds of other things, like most of my published books are children's books. I write rock and pop and that kind of stuff. My stance has to be one where, and this is kind of one of those, how do you position yourself in the flow of, what all the people in your community believe in, the writing community, the literary community. Some stuff I'll go along with and I'll listen to. Some things I just have to say, it's in me, and I'm not going to lie about it. So I remember hearing on NPR, this has been a couple of years ago, that they're talking about modern music. Now, again, I don't know a lot about this, so I'm just reporting what I heard. But, the atonal Schoenberg 12-tone music, I don't know exactly what those terms are, but that it was really, really powerful for decades. And then some of these people were starting to write melodic music again, and they were suddenly, not surprisingly, cast in the role of the big new rebels. It's Promethean over and over again. And but that they were starting to garner respect and acceptance. And of course, when I hear that, I'm just like, okay, we have a word for that. That's the pendulum. This is an old common metaphor. We know what that is. Why don't we, in the Chinese saying, let 1,000 flowers bloom, let 1,000 schools contend. I wish the Chinese could live up to their own saying. And when it comes to something like rhyme, don't look down your nose at it automatically. Nobody said you had to write it. And by the way, maybe there are arguments from great poets against rhyme that I'm not aware of that I might be more accepting of. But it doesn't work for me to stay away from it. Let's put it that way.
Well, rhyming in English is difficult, which I think automatically just placed poetry in English in a tough spot. Compared to Italian, Latin, Spanish, English is a real bitch to have to rhyme in. And you do so with surprising deftness. Surprising just because, I don't see it that often, especially in ways that aren't bent. And by bent, I mean like Dr. Seuss. Everybody loves Dr. Seuss. You can't not like Dr. Seuss. But he will just invent words. And of course, his world is bent enough to where he makes it all work. But if we had to appreciate him, from an adult's perspective, we're not going to read an epic poem he wrote.
No. Dr. Seuss is a great case, John. I never thought of this before until you brought this up. My son has this principle of comedy. My son Seth, he says, because I'd say, well, maybe that was a little too over the top, so it wasn't funny. And my son Seth goes, oh no, take it over the top and go 1,000 miles farther. And I think that's what Dr. Seuss does. So he's a super unique case that shows you how unique he is, shows you that you can't do that. And people do that all the time. One of the advice children's writers often get, people who write picture books, is not to write picture books in rhyming verse. Now, I've looked at this and I've actually written articles about this. There are still picture books that come out in rhyming verse. So what's going on here? Why is the advice different from the reality? And the answer is, as we've said before, so many people, and you can imagine how bad some of this is when you're talking about children's books, because everybody thinks they can write a children's book, right? Using everybody loosely there. So I'm very, very pleased to hear you say that I did it well. One of the things that's interesting to me about writing metered and rhymed poetry is if a poem comes to me as a metered and rhymed poem, one of my first thoughts is, oh my God, this is going to be a lot of work. I mean, the labor intensity of it, the time that you're going to have to put into it, it's harder. It's definitely much harder. But sometimes it feels like it has to. And that's when I say, man, don't argue with the muse. She doesn't show up that often. If she comes, open the door, pour her a drink, and sit down and get ready for it,
Well, and I presume when you do have more formal poetry that it's for a reason, that it's not simply because you want to show off.
Oh, yeah. It wouldn't. Actually, to tell you the truth, it never even occurred to me that it might be showing off just because I'm so afraid. It's like, oh my God, can I do this and make it work? Again, there's something, and I go back to this point earlier about, so I had a big moment when I was in college because I'd written poetry for years and I'd done a little bit of fiction. And one day, writers' lives have the weirdest turning points. I'm driving up Cascade Avenue near Colorado College in Colorado Springs, and I see a dead squirrel on the road. And when I would see things like this, at that moment, for some reason, I was moved, and I thought that was a topic for a poem. And then I started thinking, how do you write a poem about a dead squirrel? Well, now I'm a better writer. I mean, there are ways. In my mind, it didn't fit. And suddenly I thought, well, you wouldn't have to put it in a poem, Tim. You could have a dead squirrel as an image in a short story. You could have a dead squirrel here. You could write a funny song about a dead, in other words, different experiences go to different genres in a more or less natural way, at least from the individual writer's point of view. So that whole thing, sometimes things just seem to call for rhyme. And then again, I don't want to repeat that whole thing about it seems like it needs to have a more specific shape to it. Now, oddly enough, one of my poems, which is not in any of my published works, is about the firebombing of Tokyo, because more people, Dewey and his American flyers would firebomb Tokyo. More people died in the firebombings of Tokyo than died in the nuclear bombs, if I'm getting my facts right. So it's one of these horrors of war that's often overlooked. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to write a poem about that, and it pushed itself into a metered, rhymed poem because of the language and because of the subject. And I don't know exactly how to explain that more, but it had to be. It had to be that kind of poem. Maybe
the pull of history a little bit?
Tell me what you mean by that.
Just by virtue of being metered and rhymed, that it's more, it carries more historical flavor, kind of filming in black and white.
That could be true, but what's funny is I hope that's not the reason. So one of the poems in This book, I think it's in here, is a very kind of a dark look at sex. It's the one about, it reduces the genitalia to like a nub in a slot, this kind of thing. It came out as a metered in rhyme poem. And that one obviously is not, there's no, so I don't know. I this is that whole, you feel your way, right? You feel your way into a poem, into any work, and you think this is appropriate, and then sometimes it works. Most of the time it doesn't, and you hope it does. And, That's a good point, though. Yeah, I didn't even think about the pull of history in that way.
Well, and it's also, the lit crit scholar of me who just, let's come up with a convenient theory. It's probably true. It doesn't really rule out any other theories, but
nothing wrong with that.
Awfully smart. So, Tim, would you please read Amerasian Children, Vietnam, one of your rhymed and metered poems?
I'd be happy to. Thank you. We sent our men to aid the South against communist defiance, but over bars and in cat houses, they formed their own alliance. Some married the women, most did not, and suddenly Saigon fell, and the grunts came home alone, which they figured was just as well. Then America turned its back because the war brought too much pain, but the women bore their children in that green land without claim to either country, kinky hair or eyes as blue as sky, cast-off seed of strangers who had come to kill or die. And now they beg in the streets and are shunned, and Vietnam, having suffered utterly, hisses, "Go back to your own land." We don't pay much attention, fed up with foreign places, surprised to have sprinkled that distant race with such familiar faces.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
So the book is Dear Beast Loveliness, Poems of the Body. Your title, by the way, I'm going to make this a teachable moment, is one of those lovely, I don't remember who exactly coined the term, but I learned it from David Lipsky, who was my teacher. It's a beautiful monster.
I've never heard that term, a beautiful monster.
Yeah, it's where you basically find a dialectical mashup, and it creates a moment of vividness, and so love the title.
I appreciate that, John.
And now, a book discussion, a book that changed my life.
Operation Breakfast by Dan Lauer. It didn't bother me that I never discovered exactly why Joseph K. was dragged out of his cell and unceremoniously executed for no apparent reason in the trial. The reason was pretty apparent to me. Fascism. Don Gately coming to on a cold beach as the tide was way out, being the close to the 1,000-plus page Infinite Jest didn't infuriate me. After 1,000 pages, I'd come to expect ambiguous, confusing, aggravating things from David Foster Wallace. Shame on anyone who had the nerve to act surprised. What I've never managed to figure out, though, in spite of hours of contemplation and a dozen or so viewings, is what Spalding Gray's point was in the final scene of Swimming to Cambodia. The scene in question has Gray flying first class out of Thailand after finishing filming his part in the killing fields. He sips from a glass of champagne and lazily affixes a Thai purple sleep mask to his face. The line, verbatim, is, "I had an inkling. I had a flash. I suddenly thought I knew what it was that had killed Marilyn Monroe." A clip from the killing fields, in which the American embassy is being hastily evacuated and innocent Cambodian children look up, wave, and say bye-bye, follows this to end the film. Bye-bye should be the haunting moment, and it is, in a way. But even after my first viewing of Swimming to Cambodia as a 17-year-old video store clerk, I was haunted by a single question. Why the fuck was he thinking about Marilyn Monroe? Swimming to Cambodia is about a lot of things, none of which have anything to do with the former Norma Jean Baker. It was written and performed by Spalding Gray, who possesses the sort of guilt and neuroses you would typically associate with a member of the chosen tribe. He wasn't. Until his death by suicide nearly a decade ago, he was a waspy Rhode Island-born raconteur. I was a budding writer the first time I encountered Swimming to Cambodia, trying desperately to find my voice and style. I wandered from writer to writer, mimicking them as best I could, and then abandoning them for the next best thing. While working at the video store, among the racks upon racks of videotapes in the age before Blu-ray, the cover of Swimming to Cambodia stood out to me. It pictures Gray's panicked face surrounded by blue hand-drawn water, and his face is either rising from the water or sinking into it, depending on your point of view. I had no way of knowing what the story was. I'd never heard of Spalding Gray. I'd never heard of anyone named Spalding. In the days before Wikipedia was ubiquitous, you usually had to guess or take a risk with art. I had no way of seeing how many stars the film had received 12 years earlier, so I decided, fuck it, I've got nothing better to do. I took the tape home and watched it. Then I waited an hour and watched it again. It consists almost entirely of Gray sitting at a wooden table with a notebook and a glass of water. He just talks. He just tells a story. He is an outsider telling an outsider's story of a world he couldn't quite nail down. He becomes obsessive-compulsive and does everything in threes, thinking that this compulsion will land him a film role he desperately wants. Every third can of food is fine. The other two have botulism. He just can't deal with the concept of America or the American system. So he doesn't want to live there, but doesn't want to venture too far from familiar signs of civilization. So he moves to an island off the coast of America, Manhattan. In the film, there are a few small inserts of scenes from the killing fields and 2 maps as props. One map pictures Cambodia in its place nestled between Vietnam and Thailand, and the other shows the route of the horrific American bombing campaign in Cambodia and Laos during the middle years of the Vietnam War. It was called Operation Menu, but Gray accidentally mislabels it Operation Breakfast. Other than a primer on the Vietnam War, the bombings in Cambodia, Gray's experiences filming the killing fields, and the political climate of America in the late 60s. Swimming to Cambodia is the story of an anxious man struggling with having been born. It shocked me that it was so riveting and successful a story. It is literally just a man talking to an audience in a cramped theater. But Gray's style imparts a sense of impending doom, prickly as any modern political thriller. It had never occurred to me before that someone could get away with that, or if they tried, people would listen. Aspects of Swimming to Cambodia are painfully funny, but it isn't stand-up comedy. He talks, for instance, about seeing a live sex show in Thailand and describes one woman peeling and then inserting a banana into her vagina. She then aims her vagina down the center of the theater and fires. The banana launches across the theater, sticks to the back wall, slides lazily down to the floor, and is consumed by an army of cockroaches. He also tells the audience, long before this episode is described, that the only lie in the entire story is that the banana sticks when it hits. No other context is provided until it is, and to amazing effect. I was in college at the time, and I had an insatiable desire to be a writer. I had since I was a child. After watching Swimming to Cambodia, I immediately adjusted my ambitions and set out to mimic Spalding Gray and be a writer/performer. I found some local writers' circles and open mics, but never followed through. I felt like I didn't have any stories to tell, nor did I possess the skills with which to tell them. I would have to wait. I would have to make a few stories first. I've since made a few stories, perhaps more than my fair share, and of late, I've been reading some of them in front of audiences. I've managed, with varying degrees of success, to hold an audience for 5 or 10 minutes. Now, when I'm on stage, I can't help but hear Spalding Gray's voice in my head. I learned a lot from watching him work. I learned that a devastatingly funny moment now and again can pave the way for 3 or 4 devastatingly emotional ones. It's a difficult trick, but one that makes what I do worthy of an audience's attention. I also learned that it's okay to lie to people about the banana sticking, as long as you tell them up front. A wink and a nod will let you get away with murder, provided the audience isn't the butt of the joke. And when I stumble over a line because I put too many H words in a row, I think of the moments in Swimming to Cambodia when Gray struggles and fails to find the perfect way to say something. It never seemed to bother him. It still bothers me. I have a few years ahead of me before I'll be able to hold an audience for 2 hours. Spalding Gray could. He did it better than almost anyone. He knew he was never going to be the great American novelist, but he loved to write. That will get you halfway there. He was a good writer, which makes up another 40%. What he discovered is that if it's 90% on the page, an emotional, personal performance can breed that extra 10% into a story. He did that to perfection in Swimming to Cambodia. That made it all the more maddening when his body was dragged from the East River in March of 2004. He'd been missing since early January. When I read the news of his death by suicide, I couldn't help but think it made as little sense as his reference to Marilyn Monroe in the final moments of Swimming to Cambodia. He was a storyteller. Depression and loneliness aside, storytellers can't stop telling stories until there are no stories left to tell. It's in the blood. I know from experience. I can't help but wonder why he didn't stand perched on an East River bridge looking down at the icy water below, begin to laugh at how absurd the scenario was, shrug it off, and then walk home to start writing a new story about it. I'd like to think it's what I would have done. Then again, I haven't told as many stories as he did. I haven't lived as many of those moments that make for great stories. I can't help but wonder what he saw when the purple sleep mask slid down, shutting out the light. Perhaps it was the story of Swimming to Cambodia fully formed, flashing before his eyes. Then again, knowing Spalding Gray the way he made me feel I did, I doubt it. It sounds too neat, saccharine sweet. Had I accused him in person, he probably would have mocked me for thinking so in his uber-polite Rhode Island manner. It may be a peculiar parallel to draw, but the more likely possibility is that Gray saw the same thing as Kay at the end of the trial. Nothing. Darkness. And in the darkness he started to panic as things were coming to an end. No relief, but an eagerness for the next thing, the next bizarre experience, the next story to tell. I can't help but wonder why he couldn't relax. I've known people who are that way. I am not. I work hard, then harder, and when the moment ends, I am not sentimental about it, nor am I desperate to move things along. I need time to regroup and recharge. It seems to me that wasn't good enough for Gray. He wasn't looking to relax. Relaxing didn't pay the bills, and it was too terrifying a concept to just be alone with his thoughts and no direction outward. But then, these are things I know from watching Spalding Gray's work. I assume he read the trial before he killed himself. Most intellectuals and writers have. But maybe he despised Kafka. It probably never occurred to him someone might draw a parallel to his work, the endings of the trial in Infinite Jest. Maybe it did. But maybe he liked nothing more than to get off the road for a while and sit at home doing nothing with his wife and kids. It is not wise to make the unforgivable error of confusing someone's persona with their true self. It happens too often and is almost always off the mark. Regardless, as someone who, like Gray, struggled with depression, I can imagine how the person, not the performer, felt in those dark moments when the next thing didn't present itself clearly enough. It feels like two men standing over you, your head on a chopping block, passing a double-sided butcher's knife back and forth, arguing about who is going to stab you in the heart. You want to tilt your head up to look at them and ask, are you going to get to it, or am I going to have to fucking do it myself? I've enjoyed every second of live storytelling I've experienced, and I'm sure I won't be satisfied that I've said everything I need to say for a long, long time. I've never filmed a movie in Thailand. I've never dealt violently with the art mafia in Manhattan. I've never attended a sex show where the banana didn't stick. I've never performed in front of a live audience and been able to entertain them for 2 solid hours. I still need to sip champagne while affixing a Thai purple sleep mask to my face on a first-class flight out of the Far East before it's all said and done. Towards the end of his life, Spalding Gray was involved in a car accident in Ireland. He was in an incredible amount of pain, physically and emotionally. He tried to work, he tried to write his stories, but he was older. It had gotten harder. It isn't hard to imagine him tilting his head and asking the two phantom assassins standing over him to just get on with it already. He liked telling the story of his life more than he enjoyed living it. And now, I have an inkling. I have a flash.